Thank you very much. Well, we are very happy to be here in Quito, in a virtual Quito conference of the IAFFE, and it is very lovely to see all your faces. Well, I am going to change to Spanish because the conference will be in Spanish. Bueno, antes que todo, buenos días.
First of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening for all of you, all feminist economists who are seeing us right now at this virtual session entitled The Restructuring of Capitalism and the Patriarchal Offensive Perspective from Feminist Economics. This is a conference that was organized by Carmen Diana and also by the group that organized the hosts, the co-hosts who have organized this great conference. I want to introduce very briefly our speakers, and then I will say some comments related to our region, Latin America. We have here Alison Vásconez from UN Women Ecuador, Fernanda Wanderley from the Institute of Socioeconomic Research in Bolivia, Lena Lavinas from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, Natalia Moreno from the Feminist Economics Roundtable of Colombia. And the goal of this plenary is to establish a dialogue between our speakers and then a dialogue with all of you attending the conference. When we want to speak about Latin America, and before starting with this message we want to convey, it's very important to mention that Latin America, just as any other country in Africa or the Southeast Asia or other countries that could be framed under the definition of Global South, they all have been undergoing great processes of structural change. And right now, 12 years into the 2008 crisis and 50 years after recurring crisis in Latin America, we want to focus on what we call the process of financialization. Starting from this concept of financialization, how this has contributed to a social crisis, we see women in Latin America and the Caribbean being on a constant discussion, on a constant uncertainty and political upheaval and the deepening of inequalities and structural problems. Before the pandemic, feminist economists have been focused on social movements to achieve equal situations. On March the 8th, International Women's Day on 2020, minutes before the lockdown, this went into history because our region was all green or purple to show the demands of feminism, where we see the intertwining of race, ethnicity, social class, gender. We have achieved a process of awareness to stop being ignorant. Since we live in a patriarchal society, misogynist societies, it's necessary to put into evidence this constantly in demonstrations, in art, in music, and in parliaments. And why is this? Because the main feature joining all our democratic regimes is democracy. We live in democracy. And this is evident in public policies that are not gender sensitive. These policies are drawn towards a patriarchal state. And to this date, we have not decided to improve marginalization for women, which is caused by austerity policies of the Washington Consensus implemented over the last few decades. The resistance decades led by women have caused a new building of feminism where all women are one voice. This led to building waves of feminism in all sectors of society. Feminism that has its own demands that joins the voices of the global South. Feminism that is rooted to fight institutional violence, requiring a new response in the face of drastic situations based on collective issues, to face uncertainty and the crisis in care and family violence. We have seen the establishment of a greater oppression towards women, increasing violence problems and femicides, without any effective response from the governments. Vulnerability in the region in Latin America shows that the struggles of women are key to sustain life, a responsibility that has been placed on women in all sectors, public and private. In our region, we are the pillar of this unpaid work and the support of life, the key part of the social reproduction. The advancement of the eco-feminist movement involves women as social beings, where a patriarchal system exploits land through extractivism, agribusiness, and exploiting bodies in all sectors. We've seen the nature being violated, receiving violence, and this started some years ago, and it has increased structural discrimination between different genders. Resistance from fighters, all of them together, has suffered a process of criminalization without any justice, without any legislative apparatus punishing a system that wants to have profit. At the same time, our raw materials are punished with low prices, and there's speculation in financial markets as a response to the interest of investors, the main actors of financialization. One day after the lockdown and during the pandemic, we cannot envision a future without mentioning labor precarity and massive unemployment and the increase of unpaid hours within the households, the loss of income suffered by many popular economy women, and given the structural needs of households, have had a consequence of a rise in vulnerability indicators. This rise even more for Afro-descendant women, migrant women, trans women. And beyond this devastating stance outlook, we lack tools to face new normality. First of all, we lack access to water, to health services, to schools with energy, and we suffer food insecurity. And that is we also see a gap in technology. Financial institutions have profited on women under the motto of women empowerment, but pushing them to depend of this devastating financial systems. On the other hand, the drop of 7.7% of GDP in Latin America has put 56.9% of women at a high risk, 18.6% in medium risk, and 24.4% at low risk. Our situation is not the result of the behavior of economy in the face of COVID-19. The Economic Convention for Latin America on the recent reports on the social outlook has shown the fiscal and monetary policies focused on reducing fiscal deficit. Our countries have complied with the IMF and its restrictions, putting their own central banks in an austerity policy schemes. We see the concept of external debt expanding. That is why we need to organize social public spending with gender-sensitive policies, and it's a priority to draft a feminist agenda. And by showing this situation of women in the pandemic and envisioning a different future, we will start the dialogue with our panelists in the framework of a feminist tsunami. So I will ask the first question. The first question, and I will give the order, then Alison, then Fernanda, then Lena, and Natalia at the end, and we prepared 3 questions to start the dialogue. The first is, over the last decades, which were the main advancements, innovations, norms, and public policies on feminist agendas and movements in your country, in your region? And if you can, give us a balance of advancements and backward movements. Alison, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Alicia. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to all of you who are here. It's my pleasure to see you. I would say that unfortunately the balance is negative. It's a balance that has many nuances of discomfort or lack of hope. I would like to start by establishing 2 elements that I think that have been present in Latin America and Ecuador in particular, and they are still present. The first one is poverty. There's a matrix always present in Latin America. It's a paradigm that has been renewed when we see the responses to the crisis. And this poverty paradigm is related to 3 elements. First, this feminization of poverty. That is, women have been very closely related to poverty, always, without taking into account their contributions, and also thinking that women are the ideal poor people. Some Latin America people have said this. Women have been the middle person between the states and the families. They have met the role that the state is not meeting, and this is the case. This is something that we will surely debate when we see the responses, the solutions to the crisis. Women are still the ideal poor people. They are still the most hot hit. And the third point is women have been the major poor in the social landscape. We're always outside the major capital circuits because we are always linked to economies from the outside. That paradigm is prevailing. In Ecuador, if you ask me about the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen 3 watershed moments. The first one is when we had this attack by the neoliberal paradigm, which focuses on an individualist model of development. And this was present in all countries, but in Ecuador, it was particularly strong, has been a very important paradigm. And this, at some time, we know that Ecuador was part of the circuit or the circle of socialism in the 21st century, the post-neoliberal model, which then becomes post-neoliberal. And there we see from the institutional area or the legislation area, many changes that oppose this model. We see a process of mercantilization of well-being. We see an attempt to socialize the model in terms of well-being, an attempt to regulate labor rights, an attempt to reform taxes, and also an emergence from the state of what we call back then, and that time when this new thing arose, new community economies, solidarity economies that became institutionalized in Ecuador, in ministries, in policies, in different public policies agendas. All these apparatus that is very solid from the legislation point of view and from the social point of view as well, is also linked in Latin America with an economic conventionalism. There is no transformation in the economic area of the core part of this model. For instance, the trade policies, financialization, this continues living in parallel of all these supposed social changes. And the consequence, I would say, to speak of advancements in the case of women, is that in Latin America, we see a growing participation in economy, in politics, in leadership, and we see proposals of community proposals that we will delve deeper later on. But this follow an inertia of economic, social, labor indicators. We see some changes in regulations, in legislations, for instance, related to accessing financing, resources, education, technology. I think education is to be pointed out, highlighted, that come from a struggle of women movements, more than from the implementation of this new package that was so strong and solid from the state stance. I don't know if I went over my time, but yes, I think it's very interesting of what you say about what happened in Ecuador under the motto of socialism of the 21st century. I would give the floor now to Fernanda. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are here. I think this was very interesting to build on what Alison was saying, because in Bolivia, we have also seen at the beginning of the 21st century a progressive government, which is quite similar to the experience of Ecuador. I would like to start by pointing out the case of Bolivia. And here, the social energy, the capability of organizing themselves that the society has, which is very much uprooted in race, in ethnicity. And from the 90s onwards, this social energy grew stronger and stronger, and women were the protagonists of this movement. New voices, new stakeholders, and all this social energy demanded advancements, important advancements in regulations, in legislation, in public policy, and this we achieved to include in the public agenda the topic of inequality, gender inequality, with the focus on the problem of violence against women, gender-based violence, which persists to this day. So we have this multiplicity of new voices in the society, and this capability of building new platforms with new rhetoric, new proposals, such as ecofeminism and youth surging in this new feminism, the community feminism, the empowerment of women, of indigenous, peasant women in their organizations. So we see this link with nature, but all of this, we see a remarkable point at the Constitution Assembly with the government of Evo Morales in 2016, which had the enormous participation of women, of feminists, of different nuances and colors and discourses, but this resulted in a political constitution of the state that it's quite progressive. So we have a constitution in which we acknowledge care tasks and rights for these women and a vision of equality rights. This is a victory of feminist movements and the social society. We also seen an advancement in the political participation of women in legislative and executive areas. During the second term of Evo Morales, we achieved equality, but then this was reduced, and we have to see that this was a whole long process. But I would like to highlight something, because we will saw a proposal of plural economy, a social solidarity economy, and those actors in which women are very important. And we have seen some advancements in the sector of political participation and in the sector of violence, which started in the 90s. This is not something that started in the 2000s, but it grew very much during these years. But in terms of Bolivia, as many other countries, has this contradiction. We see rhetoric advancements, norm advancements that are very strong and solid, but with low implementation in terms of public policy. So we see a gap between speech and effective transformation in terms of public policy and institutions. This on the one hand. So the results at the end up being, well, we weren't able to improve this problem, to bridge the gap in violence, and political participation of women still finds barriers, frontiers to have an autonomous participation, to create a feminist agenda, among many other issues. And as for economic participation, despite the increase in participation in the labor market from women, we are still working in the most precarious jobs, most vulnerable jobs, even before the pandemics, outside social assistance or social protection, outside regulation. So we are still without social benefits and in a very limited protection system. And this has to do with what Alison says. Despite having improved indicators of poverty, inequality in a context of a boom of raw materials in the whole region, we are still seeing structural issues, and we have not changed any position in that area. And finally, the agenda of care tasks that has been placing a priority in feminist movements and organizations by women. This is a priority today in this country. This agenda was not passed as we would want it to. So that is also a challenge that we still have ahead.
That's very interesting, Fernanda. Thank you. We seem to think that sometimes the governments of the 21st century that have been democratically elected seem to have a feminist agenda, but it didn't seem so, and we still have equality issues. So now I'm going to give the floor to Elena. Elena, you have the floor, please. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today with all of you. I'd like to thank Carmen for the invitation. Thank you, Alicia, for your introduction. It was excellent and showing what happens throughout the entire region with important differences, but also with something in common, which is these international markets through the exports of commodities. This is what's happening now more and more. Because again, we have the prices of the commodities as the alternative to Latin America to leave the crisis behind. We have the same things, and this is the structural problem of Latin America. And I think we're going to speak about that later on. What I wanted to say now, very, very quickly, I'm just going to do a very short presentation just to say that Brazil had a democratization process. From 1985, it's been very strong. Women participated in this process, and it was a process that upheld a series of democratic deficits. It's a transmission that was decided by the top of the pyramid. The military were able to maintain their hegemony in this transition. And so today we have this right-winged government, which is the consequence of all the governments which accepted, even the progressive governments, which accepted to keep silent during this whole transition period, which gave rise to many consequences for women. So we had democratic deficits which were very major. So we participated in the construction of a new constitution, this new constitution of 1985, with equality for men and women. We introduced changes such as access for women to rural property, since many women worked in rural areas, and we underwent some other structural changes. Just now, I wanted to mention that from the 70s onwards, I've been participating in a feminist movement, and we've been doing it for 40 years. It's called Colectivo Feminista, Feminist Collective, to show the strength of feminist women, which today is very plural, because we have not only our generation of women, but we have very strong presence of young feminism, feminism from rural areas. And there is a major change coming of a feminism of middle class to an even broader and bigger feminism with more cultural participation. So we need to have more unity in our actions, because I think that this is a problem. So the question was about moving forward and moving backwards. So I'm going to show you and share with you what happened in Ciclo Video, which is a feminist movement. We've had several setbacks, several norm setback and public policy setbacks. Major breakthroughs were in the fight against gender violence, and Maria da Peña initiated actions against people who conduct violent acts against women. And then we passed a law on women, on femicide, women homicide. So we want to reduce gender violence, but this is still a major struggle. We're watching and looking out for all forms of sexual violence. We have a hotline to collect claims. Women have more information, are more informed on their rights, and they feel more secure because they have a law. The press always covers feminist aspects, but still the law hasn't changed as we expected it. So we passed a new law for formalization of domestic work, paid domestic work. And so 6 million Brazilian people worked as domestic workers. It was the biggest paid activity for women in Brazil, but there was no real breakthrough to strengthen the domestic workers' labor rights. Only 30% were legally registered as domestic workers. So we can say that regarding gender equality, the law is still quite weak. As regards reproductive rights, which is our most difficult fight since 2010 under the Labor Party, the Workers' Party, because of the evangelist pressure and the Catholic Church pressure, Brazil established a protocol of abortion cases with the WHO, and in the international scenario, it's one of the most reactive voices to the reproductive rights of women. Things have not gone very well with this extreme right-winged, radical right-winged government. And since 2019, we're at a crossroads with women's rights, both on a national and international level. And our greater threat right now is to try to amend the Constitution. So I am defending the right to life from birth. So from the Ministry of Women's Rights to provide rights to non-born children. The right of birth would lead to abortion right in the case of rapes, and all of these rights for a right to abortion, to try to restrict the right to abortion in Brazil, and this is due to the right-wing government. So many of our setbacks are a direct result of what happened with the left-winged governments in the sector of reproductive rights. And then in the year 2010, to obtain a majority in Congress, it was necessary to establish alliances with evangelists and to accept and to negotiate with the Catholic Church. So I just wanted to show you that under governments which were said to be progressive, was still very difficult for women to move forward. And there was no right, there was no equality, there were a lot of difficulties for all these families to sustain their way of life. It's clear that here in Brazil, a greater participation from all women, young women, labor market women, it's crucial that they participate or we will have great consequences. One of the worst consequences of the pandemic was that many women had to leave the workforce. They had to completely abandon looking for paid work because we are in the middle of a labor market transition, a very significant transition. We're in the middle of a technological transition, which can have very negative impacts on women. So thank you. Thank you, Lena. So you said something important in the beginning, which is the price of commodities when they go up or down. It's something that we need to take into consideration because this affects the profits, and the profits go to the central bank, and that goes to the creation of employment or to the termination of employment, and it makes up the fiscal policies where gender focus is not a key focus for progressive governments. Now I'm going to give the floor to Natalia. Natalia, please, you have the floor. Thank you, Alicia. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you. Thank you, Carmen, and all my other feminist comrades for pushing me and inviting me to participate. So I would say that in Latin America, we can talk about an impressionist model where politics was focused on foreign capital and not the national economy. And this is a focus of the right-wing government, which fostered alliances with multinational companies and corporations. Extractivism is a major issue for the development of financial capital in the country. And the result of this has been that we are the fifth most unequal country in the world. We have 40% of the population that is poor, low class. And so I think that with those statistics, I can show what has been 100 years of right-wing governments in our country and the situation of women in our country. Here in Colombia, there is absolute separation of the political economy from the social economy. There's no state of well-being in Colombia. There's no transfer model that exists in other countries, and all of this with an armed conflict that has affected our social agenda and the social struggle of the feminist model for the last 20 or 30 years in our country. So I would say that within this framework, the advances that the feminist movement have had is that we've still got a lot of challenges to go through. We've had great accomplishments, but they've been mainly, as if we analyze it from the 3 R's, they've been focused on the acknowledgement, on the policies of acknowledging our rights, then on politics of inclusion and representation, starting with our constitution, which is quite progressive on paper, but that in practice, it's not that progressive and it's not applied. It has a lot of neoliberal policies. So I believe that in the last few years, this feminist movement has been centered on issues of war and peace, on victims and human rights advocates. So there are international organizations in Colombia that work with these issues. And in other issues, I think we've had some breakthroughs in feminist movements regarding laws to fight against violence, laws of 2007 or 2008, or the law Elvira Assembly, which was a very well-known law that provides femicide as a crime in our criminal code. So what you were saying in your countries about equality. In the formal, we have 2 laws of quotas in the public administration and in Congress to demand parties that 30% of their list should be made up by women. And a few weeks ago or months ago, we got it up to 50% in theory, but not in practice. And so we have this quota law for the public sector as well. And we have women's public offices and women's offices that provide protection for women here in Colombia. We also have a lot of woman participation in Congress. In the year 2011, we had the first woman mayor, Claudia Lopez. In the health sector, I would say that the most important thing is the right to abortion, a law which was passed, and also the incorporation of contraceptives in health, that women should have access to contraceptives. And as regards feminist economies, I think that there are 3 important landmarks. The law 1413, which demands that they publish the content thanks to the statistics, thanks to the pressure of feminist economists and congresswomen that pressured with this. And then we had a law where we took out the value, aggregated value VAT tax on contraceptives. And we incorporated gender-related issues to the budget. And we created a central care system in Bogota. We have another law. Magdalena Leon is here in this conversation. She's an expert, just like Carmen, of a rural woman who tried to have access to women's equal right to access to their own property, which in theory exists, but not in practice. So we still have a long way to go. So to conclude, I would say that unfortunately, we are mainly in the framework of acknowledgement policies. We are in the first waves of feminism, and we need structural changes. We still have unequal power. There is no advancement or breakthroughs in power, but I do think that feminists are more alive than ever. Our thesis and our proposals need to be in the front line of public policies because we need to move forward to redistribution. We need to keep capital. Feminist economies need to continue to push and pressure. It's important for our politics and for our economy and for the feminist economy. And I would say that the most serious issue, if we were doing an analysis, is that the three autonomies in which of this conversation, the three axes of this conversation, I think that in our society, there is still collective appropriation of women. This thesis of feminist materialists, the lack of time is still one of the great inequalities that we women face. And my question is, what is women's role in society? What is our role in society? It's a deep debate. It's an important debate. What is our role? Only 18% of our Congress is made up by women. So I think that this question is still something that we need to ask ourselves. What is our role in society? And even though I don't see any major setbacks, there are still many threats. For example, in Colombia, with the consolidation of the pro-life sector, who are women who are politically active, and it's truly harming Colombia within the framework of women's rights. I think that this is a major setback for reproductive rights. We still have a lot of conservative presence by women in Congress. Maria Robledo, one of the congresswomen who is an openly feminist woman, continues to struggle every day to put our issues in the agenda. So we still have a long way to go and a big struggle in front of us. Thank you.
You've said some very interesting things as regards breakthroughs, but as regards how gender has been trapped by the conservative movement in Latin America, and also expressed as regards the relationship between the evangelist parties and the incumbent parties. I would set the example of Mexico, in where despite having parity, equality in parliament, we had, despite having 7 women that have been elected and 8 men in recent 2 or 3 weeks ago elections, the fact that we have equality does not mean that all women are feminists. And this is very important to acknowledge. I think that quotas, as many of you have mentioned, is important, but the most important thing is to draft a feminist agenda and the respect of reproductive rights. So the second question is this: to see what were the main effects of the pandemic on women, especially from your experience in your country in the Latin American context. That is, what have been the main response or strategies, individual and collective strategies to face the pandemic? I think this question should be pointed towards those who lead the presidencies of our countries. I don't know if they would able to answer this, but we will try to make a reflection on this. Alison, you have the floor. Thank you very much. I would love to comment what our colleagues said, but we unfortunately don't have much time. So I wanted to say two things. Building on what Natalia was saying, we are seeing a political dispute and debate. It's urgent to go back to the policies, economic policy, and a feminist economic policy to go forward. Speaking of the several intersectionalities and inequalities. And in those inequalities, we have to see the relationship to capital, because this circuit of capital, as I was saying, is going forward in parallel, but we are within a context of inequalities that are intersectional, and we relate to one another with the same capital, and we feed that capital in different ways. So the crisis, what made us see is this precisely. One of my colleagues, and a feminist economist from India, said that this is a crisis that is not a work crisis, it's a crisis of capital reproduction on the basis of what is happening with employment. So I think that on that basis, the consequence of this crisis is a visibilization, an unveiling of the situation, this separation of these two scopes of action. We've really struggled to understand the relationship of this as feminists. So as for consequences in Ecuador, and I think in the whole world, what we've seen is an exacerbation of this multiplicity of inequalities, of these different layers of inequality that have been unveiled and separated. We've seen a burden or a disintegration of society and of the struggles that we had before the pandemic, caused by this absent state and this short answer by states, and the crisis of representation and the attempt that we have to carry out this struggle. This is the consequence, and we've seen this in Chile, in Colombia, and also in other countries. Because lockdown makes us question all these forms of representation of movements, of reorganization, and this contradiction between the scope of employment and the scope of capital. We see a persistence of factors that continue with inequality, poverty, and the failure of 30 or 4-year-long models in the fight against poverty, for instance. And the fall of these models, many economists were saying, well, this is the end of poverty, but all this optimistic rhetoric falls down. And why? Because we are seeing a crisis in the reproduction of capital. We're seeing the weakness of states in Ecuador that was already in place before the pandemic, but which outburst in October 2019 in the crisis. And also we're going back to this orthodox model in economics. We are going back to all of what we were hearing by the IMF before 2019 that we should carry out these actions as a consequence of this crisis, because in the response in Ecuador to the crisis was really orthodox. Instead of seeing these enormous packages that are the envy of the North countries, of stimulus packages and fiscal packages, we've seen the reduction of these policies. We've seen austerity policies. We've seen the reduction of a cut in the budget for healthcare area. We've seen the layoff of many of these employees. So we see an agenda that was on its way, that was contested by social movements in October, and we've seen the leveraging of the crisis and the lockdown and the social and health crisis to go deeper into that crisis. We've seen 3 or 4 economic reforms in Ecuador that surely if we had not seen this physical or health crisis, this would not happen. So we've seen 3 or 4 reforms, as post solidarity law, a humanitarian law that finally, in the end, it continued and legalized a dismantlement of labor rights that was already on its way before. For instance, we see the enforcement of different methods of hiring people. We had seen a regulation, and we are seeing a new emergency contracts focused on reducing the labor hours, reducing wages, breaking contracts at any times due to this emergency. Let's say these contracts that were for any amount of money for any amount of time. And we also see an enforcement of the wish of the employers section, which is to make layoff cheaper. This is cheaper right now because supposedly to save companies, this would help them to avoid bankruptcy. But of course, dismantling the labor rights, we've seen specific declaration by unions that say that it's the rights that create unemployment and the rights that create this crisis. This is why we're seeing these new reforms that go through the National Assembly, and they were passed while everything else was going on, while we saw dead bodies on the streets, as we unfortunately saw in some Ecuadorian cities. So besides unveiling structural inequalities, it also unveils this process that we have already faced. We were already facing, of going back to orthodox models, conservative models in economic and social policies, and the agenda in Ecuador as a whole, imposed by international organizations. Of course, in the context of Latin America, we went into a very large debt, but which is supposedly flexible, but it would surely have very serious consequences in 2 years' time. Maybe I can show you some indicators what has happened. In the case of women, for instance, unemployment was on the rise, but now we see the double as in compared to men, even double in the case of young women. 7% of women saw their labor offer diminished. 80% of them increased their care tasks. We don't have official figures because we don't have the budget to do this type of service, but we know that this impact exists on care tasks by women. what we call inadequate work rose by 30% in the case of women, especially among the younger ones, especially in rural areas. And income were reduced by half. And in the case of women that were autonomous workers or on-account workers, almost half of them suffered this impact. One of the demands from feminist movements was that this is not freeing being an on-account worker. It is even more impoverishing. So this is one of the consequences of this crisis. So in terms of packages, fiscal packages in the case of Ecuador, I would say there are some things related to financing or flexible access to credit. So in the financial world, there are a few implementations, but there was nothing that was specifically focused on women. In fact, as UN Women, we carried out an analysis of response packages all around the world in Latin America, and to almost 50% of all packages were related to care or support for those who carry out care tasks or social protection focused on women, but none of them had any of these implementations. Most of these policies or programs are focused on the highest income countries per capita. The care services were open, but at the peak of the crisis in Ecuador, for instance, unemployment tripled and there was no response. And in our case, there still are no responses for the impact on women. I think that's a structural issue that is being unveiled right now and that is falling apart as well. And of course, it's a situation that places us in a very fragile position within the economy and within our quality of life. So we will go deeper later on, but I wanted to build on the fact that the potential that we have as feminist economists to make proposals and to build on the response that has happened at communities and from women themselves. Well, because monetary economy does stop, but feminist economy does not stop. We've seen that we were able to support families at households. Thank you very much, Alison. You've given us an outlook of how the pandemic proposed orthodox policies, a comeback of neoliberalism. Fernanda, you have the floor. I would like to start by saying how the pandemic arrived at this region, focusing on the Bolivian case, but which is very similar to other countries. First of all, I think that it's very important to place ourselves in a context. We've seen a rise of extractivist economies in Latin America that depend on international prices of commodities that concluded in 2014. So the pandemic arrived in a moment in which we were already witnessing the fall of a growth of this euphoria of transformation in some indicators or diminishing of poverty, but that was concluding in 2014 or 2015. And also we've seen the response of going deeper into extractivism. We see this in the indicators of the rise in deforestation and the use of land, not only fossil fuels and mining, but also agribusiness, etc. So that on the one hand, and on the other hand, Latin America shows differences, but has very limited social protections all over. And this in Bolivia is one of the extremes in the groups of the groups that have very, very limited social protection, despite this growth that multiplied by 4, by 5, the resources that were available to the state to create policies, social policies. Despite that, they have not in Bolivia invested in an infrastructure that we would call a care infrastructure. That is improvements in the health system, improvements in the educational system, and of course, improvements in a care system. Bolivia is very far away of what Colombia is living through. So the pandemic arrives at this moment of a decline of economy, of not being able to improve infrastructure with houses in precarious situation and enormous inequality. And also the pandemic finds Bolivia, particularly, and all the other countries in a political crisis. You already know that what happened in 2019. When the pandemic arrives, what we see undoubtedly is the increase of inequality, the increased poverty rates. And since women are structurally placed in a majority in the informal sector, Bolivia has one of the highest informal sector because 80% of the population is outside of labor regulations and social protection. There we see the majority of women that are inside the market, labor market. So despite all this growth, economic growth, and all this progressive rhetoric and all these proposals, in the case of Bolivia and in other countries, we see the development of orthodox policies. We see the participation of states, the intervention of state in economics, but actually on speech, but it does not transform economic policies of going deeper into a dependency from extractivism. And also we've seen the support to international organizations. So the capital in Bolivia was still privileged over labor, over employment and sustainability of life. This is evident in public institutions and also in the support that has been given to the employer sector in Bolivia. So mainly made up of international and national corporations. So we saw a precarization of labor, a reduction of income, and also unemployment. But we should be careful because in countries that do not have social insurance or unemployment insurance, we have to combine that with the quality of employment and underemployment. And of course, we've seen the multiplication of care work within households and families. And of course, we see the increase of lack of access to this health service. Of course, this health service collapsed. And that is related to intersectionality within class, ethnicity, etc. On the other hand, I would like to underscore as well that this showed an open opportunity for feminist movements because we have seen the visibilization of how core, how key is care. care has never been that present. So visibilizing care work within families and households, and also this key factor of organizing publicly this care tax, and that includes schools as an important institution that does not only have a teaching function but also a care function. So the closing of the schools, we have seen the closing of care institutions. We're still in that situation. We are already 1 year in the situation, and that causes an impact of having children outside of school, and also we know that many of them will not return to school. We see technology gaps and gaps within the health system. So this is an opportunity to rethink this, to expand the concept of infrastructure in this post-COVID era. And this is a pending task because building infrastructure of care is really important. We also have seen the importance of other jobs, especially when the lockdown came down. Jobs that were occupied by women. One of them is family peasant economy, which has continued feeding the population. So the city population has had the opportunity to see how they depend on this type of labor and how they have been able to access these fresh products. So there we also see the value of this type of work and how these populations are privileged. But we are also seeing other types of jobs related to the economy of care. And what I wanted to highlight as well, and I think is pending, we should study as well, is this thing of resilience of this informal economy, which was able to, with high, very, very high rates of mortality and being exposed to the virus, they were able to, in some way, stay alive in the face of the lack of supporting measures. Despite having had supporting measures, these were not enough. So we're still seeing a high rate of mortality in this sector. And finally, I would like to highlight the rise of intrafamily violence, of femicides, and also gender-based violence against women, which is very much linked to violence against children, which is also on the rise in this country. And the rise of mother mortality, which is very important. Finally, I would like to mention something that is, I think, is our greatest challenge ahead, and maybe we can go deeper into that in the next round of questions, is that the feminist women movements in Bolivia and maybe in other countries really the issue of economic policies is not something that is a priority within the dialogue of feminists. So we are still missing very significantly in the debate of this model, economic model of our strategies, which implies that we need to have a central debate on what should be the pathway to achieve economic recovery in this post-pandemic era. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernanda. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentations, because listening to the situation of Bolivia, it seems as if I were hearing the situation of my country, of Mexico, but I have no more comments because our time is very limited. So Lena, you have the floor. So I'm gonna try and stick to my 3 minutes, because if not, we won't have time for the debate. So I agree with what Fernanda has said. I believe that the feminist economy is not present today, at least not in Brazil. I don't think it's present in Latin America. There isn't a matrix or any paradigm that allows us to answer, to discuss, to debate strategies, and with the left-wing parties, because we, with the left-wing parties, we feminists have a bond with the left-wing government due to things of gender, race. All of that is a Marxist axis. And I think that we were very little critical of the left-wing government. The left-wing government acknowledged us, gave us many things, but doesn't provide us with the space to have an open democratic debate on all the possible changes in a Latin American society, which is still colonial, violent, and where the deepest mark is the structure. We cannot eliminate this excess of labor. We have to try, we have to create something completely different. And I don't think that we feminists are have the conditions today to do so. We don't have the tools to do so. Feminists and women in general liked the universal income plans. There was a monetization, a terrible monetization of poverty. And so now we have a great collateral. People can exit the financial system because they get payments from government and they could take out loans. So they were residual policies, and we sacrificed the most important thing to create gender equality, the equalization of access to health policies, education policies. Look at Chile, for example. Look at what happened in Chile with the privatization of the university. The same happens in Brazil. Everything that we did to provide access to public universities, 75% of the tuitions of the universities are in private paid universities. So we have the same problem as in USA or the UK, which is terrible. It's more than 1 million reales what people have to pay to study a university career here. So there were some politics that were neoliberal, but it was a false equality. I think we feminists didn't have the courage to discuss this deeply because they were politics of the left-wing party. And it was truly neoliberal. So I think that we need to do a self-awareness, a conscience reflection, because we speak so much of who's responsible for this and for that. But the truth is that what happened is that I was critical, but we as feminists supported the advances of social plans and not of provisions of public services. That is Latin America, everything public with segmentation. So going back to the topic of what happened with the pandemic, I just wanted to say that in Brazil now has more people with more death, the most deaths, even more than India. And that is a complete lack of respect for life. It's a right-winged government. It's not a government at all. And they are guilty for these statistics. And this is a number. We've reached a number of, we've consumed 85% of the provisions that we had set up to help the population to fight the pandemic. Thus, last year, the government approved a budget, a war budget, and we have a very limited budget. The government wanted 24 million reales for war budget. And so there was deliberate action by the government to try to avoid all the cares, all the necessary cares, and to invest in the necessary equipment to protect life, to protect the economic life. And we have the opponents, the political opponents are all very divided. So the opponents need to reorganize, because if it's very divided, we'll never achieve anything. So maybe next year we can develop a strategy to change this situation. I think that the impact of the pandemic was the loss of employment for many women, and they definitely, and once and for all, left the labor market. 2 million domestic workers were left unemployed without any universal assistance because they were informal workers. In Brazil, in Latin America, the social protection systems are very weak. But this is also true in the USA. And the unemployment plan is collected by very, very few people in the USA. So the government needs to pass an extraordinary budget, and they paid an emergency fund. They paid an emergency fund, which was 3 times more important than fighting poverty. But for women who have families, who have to feed their children, they were offered 6 times the normal amount to fight the pandemic. It was 6 times more, the amount was 6 times more than in a normal situation. So the support for this right-wing government of Bolsonaro improved because people like having money in their pockets. But I don't think that this is enough. We need to see what the strategies are. We need to see the strategies of the left-wing party and the right-wing party, because I know that what other countries are going through the same thing. There was a complete breakdown of the systems of social security, and there was total privatization of the services. So despite this risky context, the Ministry of Women, Family and Human Rights met 6% of the budget approved in 2020 to fight violence on gender, which left women truly unprotected. It was a deliberate action by the government. So as Fernanda was saying, in Bolivia and other countries, there was a great increase in domestic violence. Mother mortality rates also increased. The feminist network of gynecologists and obstetricians pointed out that new mothers in the world during the first 6 months of the pandemic suffered and were deeply harmed because they lacked prenatal attention, which could develop side effects. As regards reproductive rights, which were not considered essential because of the pandemic, and movements that deny the rights of women contributed to triple the amount of unwanted pregnancies, with emotional risks, sanitary risks of unknown proportions as before. The opponents of the Bolsonaro government created a commission in the Senate that is now working to investigate the causes of such inefficiency in the management of the pandemic. There are 11 senators that are women, but none of them make up the commission because they were not assigned to that commission by the parties. So there is no parity in the commissions. Commissions are not fair, they're not equal. So we know that the feminist force, in great amount, many of them are conservative. It's not just enough to have women participation. We need feminist participation. We need to earn the hearts of men and women. We need to make women feminists, because conservative women don't guarantee feminist rights. None of these women have put up for debate the negligence, the deliberate negligence of the federal government in the defense of the rights of women in health and other rights, in any other reproductive rights. And I have many more statistics on poor women, Black women, and the new generations. To conclude, in Brazil, the country fell by 26 positions in the World Economic Forum. We went from position 67 of 157 countries, we went from 57, we went from 26 to 57. And this was because of the lack of representation in the legislative power, in the executive power, and in the judicial. Many politicians use the budgets to finance their election campaigns. So there are many things moving forward, but there are also many setbacks. And I think that the problem is that we feminists fail to implement the logics of a feminist economy in order to build a social economic solution, because we've done many concessions. We've settled to the left-wing government. So all the power necessary to keep the left-wing party. So we have access to a ministry, the Ministry of Women, for example, a minister that is anti-gender, family woman, truly violent. But this isn't enough. We need to have a revolution. We need to transform the axis and the ideological matrices and the material matrices of reproduction. So I think that we feminists in Latin America have come a long way in reproductive rights, in abortion rights, what we've learned from our comrades in Argentina, what's happening now in Chile. But I think that here in Brazil, we're not working enough on what is the reality of capitalism today and how we're going to work to truly change the structure of this society. Thank you very much. Lena, so what you put here in the round table is basically the patriarchal system that we live in. Regardless of the laws, of the women laws, or the women rights, they've used the pandemic to reinforce their patriarchal positions. And it doesn't matter if it's a right-wing party or a left-wing party, the government is still patriarchal. Natalia, please, you have the floor. Thank you, Alicia. I'm going to try and be brief. I've been asked to speak slower for the translation. So as regards the pandemic in Colombia, unfortunately, there's not a lot to say. I would say that the pandemic in Colombia is in the streets. Anyone who turns on the TV can draw up their own conclusions.
Una gran convulsión social durante más de 30 días.
There's great social manifestation in the streets. And I would like to give you some statistics. The government released 180 decrees during the pandemic that did not go through Congress. Congress was closed for a very long time. And one of the great demands of the opponents of the opposing party was that they would reopen the Congress. And these decrees published by the government didn't take into account any feminist rights. Other examples, Brazil 12%, Argentina 6%. Mexico invested 2.3 to liberalize patents. A bill was passed in Congress that removed responsibility, took away responsibility from the companies of vaccinations and of the side effects, the secondary side effects. The ILO published a list of the countries that very well managed the pandemic, and Colombia is in position 51. So I think that the biggest change is that the people are on the streets and the executive power took complete control and governed through decree laws instead of operating through Congress. And government created a fund to finance companies, to finance private companies. I would say that that's the only thing that our vice president has done. So I think that the pandemic showed that feminist claims are real and true. This phrase that I like so much by a French author, that all society needs the production of goods and services and the reproduction of life. And I don't think that anybody's willing to refute this phrase today. And I hope that we can talk about this in this Congress and in universities to say that the economy, that the reproductive rights is fundamental for the reproduction of society, because it's a crisis that one is completely linked to the other. So through experience and through practice, as Javier Pineda was saying, we have to put ourselves in the place of the other people, of domestic workers. And we hope to truly have a shift in the way of thinking and change. I don't think that we can keep ignoring these violations. And it shows us how during the pandemic, Latin America has had a setback going back to the way it was like 40 years ago. Our mayor uses a phrase a lot and say that the advancement of the lower class was thanks to the unpaid work done by meaning. And although poverty apparently diminished, poverty that is only apparent, poverty has not diminished a lot. So it becomes clear that this crisis of the pandemic impacted mostly women, and I'm going to center myself specifically on that. For example, here you have some statistics. I know that you did this with the DANO, the paid work sector of domestic workers in Colombia and paid care work in Colombia lost more than 1 million job positions during the pandemic. Women whose main activities were domestic work increased in Colombia by 1,600,000. So almost Bogota has all those women who left that workforce and are unemployed as domestic workers. Before the pandemic, it was 800,000 women that did domestic work. Now you have 1,200,000. So there's a 50% increase. That was what Lena was saying before. So the pandemic made us return to the four walls of care work. And so this stopped transformation, and it's reflected in the participation of women in the workforce. For the first time in Colombia in the last 25 years, there has been a fall in the rate of working women for 40 years. And this is quite serious in the advancement of feminism, feminist economy, and the scope of economy for women. And of course, statistics are not just nationalization. We think of the time that we dedicate to our work. And of the statistics, what caught my eye is that there is a major and serious setback, that although in the home, people increase their working time in unpaid hours, while they increase the amount of time that they did unpaid work, and men reduced time in their paid work and increased unpaid work by 2 hours, which I think is a great challenge. And although this is positioned in domestic work as a contribution to wealth, there was no democratization towards the homes. And I think that this is a great challenge in the framework of this pandemic. And to conclude, I'd like to say that after the pandemic, we have a care work that is carried out by the family because the schools are closed. So the care systems, the government has a major role to play as the major provider of care services. We need to value this work, we value the services of care work. And so the system, we had a setback, and the system has been patriarchized. So I think that we need to go back to the roots because we're having many setbacks because of the pandemic. So the breakthroughs are being lost. And I think that this is a huge alarm that we as feminist economies cannot allow. It cannot be that there are 17 million women that have lost their autonomy and are doing unpaid work. It's 1 in 3 women in the country. And I'd like to repeat what was said before. If we allow this to continue consolidating, if we start to see this as the new normal, we women are not going to be able to move politically, to organize politically. And I think that this is risky, because if we are not involved in politics, we have 30% of the people who don't have jobs, with no economic autonomy, with no possibility of emancipation. So on the positive side, I could say that in Bogota, I lead this program, so I can say that we moved forward in the care work. It wasn't thought out as a policy because of the pandemic. It was purely a coincidence to win the elections in Bogota in 2020, and the program began with the pandemic. And so I like to say that this is positive, because in previous conversations, as we said, I believe that it's important to say that this is a policy that is inspired on feminist economy, and it can be a good example of an answer to what we are living today in the framework of the pandemic. This system that has the main goal of freeing up time for women. That's the goal of the system. What for? To give them back their lost opportunities, to give them the opportunity to have a great economic autonomy. So I think that there are three ways to operate. First, economic focus, territorial focus is very important when creating policies. From the urban feminist point of view, we provided a new way of providing services. We have care areas, geographic areas in the city where we centralized and we provide services for care workers and for people who require care. In cities so big, it's a key factor that we go out of our comfort zone, that we go to other terrains in order to offer services, care services. So that way we can move forward and provide jobs for care workers. Also, proximity is an important factor. In this care area, it's important that these services don't think only of who requires care, but of the people who carry out the care work, the paid care work. Because if they are proximate to the addresses of the people, it has to be done simultaneously. Today we have 5 care units in different times. And so we provide services for the care workers and those who are cared for. And it's a practical way to reduce times for women and those spaces where the government takes care. Government provides care, and they can access education services, well-being services. And I think our major challenge is to be able to connect this liberation of time for women, which is a redistribution of time, with programs that can redistribute profits and return their economic autonomy to women. I think that's the major challenge. It's not just having a budget to provide care services, it's to connect with autonomous economic programs that provide employment for these women. Because part of the problem of poverty is not just from the perspective of demand, where women don't have time to have a formal job, but also from the side of the offer on how economic policies and employment policies reactivate sectors that were traditionally feminist, or provide opportunities for women to train and develop and be able to go out and go work in the labor market. So I believe, as Maria Pasos Moran says, care and employment are two sides of the same coin. So We don't only have to meet the demands of the 3 R's to acknowledge, reduce, and invest in care work, but we also need to find autonomy, economic autonomy, especially in these times. So this is how in my country, in Bogota, we've tried to implement this. We've tried to reach the houses of women, and we're going to launch a program in the next few days called Relevos a Domicilio. So taking the care work house by house. And this is important during this framework of quarantine and lockdown. And we can try and help these women with the provision of their services. And I think that this is a way in which we can strengthen programs to reactivate the economy in order to transform the economy and move forward. And I would also like to say that there is a public services agreement which fosters the sense and the reactivations of feminized sectors, and it gives the advantage to those who reach an agreement with the government. If the government hires women, they would get a benefit. And so to conclude, everything that has to do with violence that my colleagues have already mentioned, I believe that the pandemic has highlighted all this violence based on gender, all these phrases of that's what happened because she dressed like this or because she went out on her own. And so today, in the framework of the pandemic, with our families in our homes, we see that this violence has increased majorly. So in Bogota, I just wanted to mention some of the measures that we took to prevent violence, which were, for example, we tripled the security guards. We virtualized equal attention. Bogota has 20 women centers where they can get attention, and the times were broadened. And we have shelters and refugees for those women. And something that is truly innovative, we did an agreement with the private sector so that women can go and claim and file a claim that they're suffering from violence. So unfortunately, I'm sorry that my position is so negative, but I am just so mad with the government. I don't think that they manage the pandemic efficiently, especially in everything that has to do with care work. And we have a VP that truly wasn't up to the challenge of managing this pandemic. And there was a fund created to finance companies. And so this is my contribution, and then we're going to talk about feminist corporations. But, well, we're going to move forward. So this is my contribution. Thanks.
Very well, Natalia. Of course, you have said some interesting things, and I think it's very important to mention this recovery of time for women for themselves, and also to improve their knowledge, to feel free of a burden, extremely great burden of unpaid work. This is also part of something I think that we mentioned before here in this session, and also that we talked before, the increase within households. violence within households. It's also psychological violence caused by this confinement, this lockdowns within families. And we have the last question. The last question is, in a continent dominated by extractivism and extractivist policies, what's the axis of feminist agendas so that the movements create some spaces? And I also have another question here from Edith Creeper. She says, thank you for this great debate. I wondered whether you see or whether there are links and alliances made with the sustainability movement. I think that we touched on the topic of ecofeminisms, and also we have a message from Diana. Congratulations, Natalia. We greet you from Ecuador, from a movement of women survivors of violence. So I understand we have only 9 minutes left, so I will give you the floor, and if you can please answer the question in less than a minute and a half, to quickly, very briefly comment on this to close the session. And the most important thing of this event is that for the first time we have recorded all sessions, so we can continue sharing them even with our friends or our students. And this has helped us a lot to have the support of these institutions that have sponsored this great IAFFE event 2021 in Quito, Ecuador. So Alison, first, maybe you can comment very briefly. Thank you very much, Alicia. What a hard task it is to have a brief comment on this. I wanted to mention something when we were speaking about threats and to always to then propose things. Well, this has to do with the danger of this undercover feminisms, the 1% feminism. The gender clause included in the IMF agreements that we actually signed here in Ecuador are very important, because beyond this debate, there's also an appropriation of rhetoric, of concepts and positions of feminism. So we should be very much aware of this. This could be the topic of another debate. The only thing I would like to leave you with, independently of considering the important initiatives such as what Natalia was mentioning, but Ecuador and other countries I was speaking about, there are important initiatives from a very long time to sustain life from women. In the case of Ecuador, for indigenous women, we are learning a lot from this, but also these are the elements that have sustained crisis. I wanted to tell you about some ideas related to a social pact. In the case of Ecuador, many women organizations from the academia and in general, we have supported this pact because it's very much valid today. Now that we are speaking about extractivist economies, we are not. In the case of Ecuador, it has been our curse for so many years. And I think this is the opportunity to speak about the concepts of feminist economics, which are very much valid, but also we need to think about the interaction of feminist economics or political economics, solidarity economy, the need to pose these alternatives, real alternatives to the current economic models. So I wanted to tell you about the ideals of this Southern Pact. This pact speaks of tax reform, a solidarity tax reform, of something that it's necessary as a transition. It's not a goal, but a path towards the alternative economy Then we have something related to reconsidering the issue of debt to cancel this debt. This has been around as a new debate to go back to what we had before the debt, but considering sustainability. The universal basic income is something that we need to go back to. And in the case of extractivist economies, we should have a pact related to post-extractivist societies. And we have given examples in Latin America of these types of models. Thank you, Fernanda, go ahead. I believe that the challenges that we have ahead as feminist economists and for feminist economy are, first, I agree completely with Natalia that our theses are valid, but I think it's very important to have this critical view of what we lack. I think that here we have to make this jump, and I think we're starting, but we have a long way ahead. We need to overcome this current vision and to assume the issue of sustainability as a central issue. Economy is within the framework of ecological fragile systems. We need to acknowledge the environmental crisis in a very serious way. We also have to place this within a context of a debate related to the strategies of development for the future, and which are the challenges to overcome extractivism in our regions, and how we can advance in transforming social, ecological, deep patriarchal societies. So this is where our challenge lies. And of course, the last thing is to articulate and re-strengthen our thesis, our historical thesis, which is that economy implies these two aspects, the productive and the reproductive areas, and how we can propose strategies to articulate those two dimensions. Thank you very much, Fernanda. Lena, please go ahead. Well, it was my pleasure to be here with you and participate in this debate with all these feminist colleagues from Latin America, but we want to have more frequent debates, I should say. I wanted to say some things. First of all, feminist movements in Brazil are active to fight racism and to prevent the dismantling of what we have achieved during the last 20 years. To the contrary of what is happening in Chile, Argentina, and other countries, to defend a new development paradigm, this is not a priority of Brazilian feminists. It is indigenous communities and environmental activists who carry this flag. I would say that feminists should be leading the debate on the macroeconomic politics that we need in Brazil and also in other countries to expand the public sphere and the provision of quality public services. The Congress in Brazil established the ceiling of public spending in 2016 after the impeachment of President Dilma for 20 years until 2036. So social spending cannot go over, cannot grow in terms of reales. It can only be corrected according to inflation. So as a result, education investment has reduced. And in the middle of the pandemic and the COVID, the floor of per capita spending fell. It was 596 reales, and now is 555. However, instead of applying again this decree, the war budget to allow the flexibilization of fiscal policies, the government did not only comply with this, but also double these neoliberal logics and strengthen these policies with devastating consequences for the whole population. So us women have to go to the streets against privatization of social politics and the diminishing of public expenditure, because this has an impact on social reproduction and damages women the most. But this is not one of the flags of feminist movements in Brazil. Feminist economics is not developed in Brazil, and this is due to the original thought linked to the left wing, the progress, the industry. We need to have industrial revolutions and recover our economy. So I think one of the greatest challenges that we face here is to define a strategy to overcome this issue, and how are we going to engage in a discussion with the leftist movement, which is still holding this thought, which is contrary to all of we want to establish. So this is a very conservative, progressive movement, which is a feature in all left movements in Latin America. And this is not easy for us. Thank you very much, Lena. Now, Latanya, you have the floor. Well, very briefly, I think this is the most important question, is what are we going to do? What could be our common proposal in Latin America to advance and transform all of what we have talked about? Well, I believe this is the case in all of Latin America, but in Colombia, what we want, we are in agreement with what we want. We have decades of academic development and movements, and I think we have 10 points of what we want. This is a checklist that has already been checked and has already been developed in all these years of feminisms. We have a proposal by feminism to the 99% of the society. If we were to be asked, if we were the government, what will we do? I think we have a proposal for the world, for the region, not only in terms of economics, but as in terms of rights. But personally, I think the problem lies in how can we organize to achieve these goals. I think this have to be one of the goals of feminism, to achieve power, to transform policies. And how is not a minor thing. The method itself is one of the greatest goals of politics. And there lies the problem on which we have to work, and we have great differences as regards the how. In my opinion, the proposal by feminism, I think, is a good example, a good way forward to achieve more things against what has been called the elite feminism or the corporate feminism. In that sense, I think the greatest challenge, at least in Colombia, is to move forward in the organization. In other countries, feminism is very well organized, which has allowed them to move forward in other struggles. For instance, in Argentina, which is not the case of Colombia. We are working in advocacy and in territories, as I mentioned before. I think we should have a consolidation of national organization to get these achievements. And to conclude, Alicia, I would say that recently the role of feminism in the world strike has been very important. The alliances between trade unionists and feminists are very important. I want to underscore how we as movement, we created some advocacy in this strike. There was a paper document released by many of our organizations, and I encourage you to read that, because this document was very important, and the role of mothers was very important during the strikes. We're not in a secondary place. We are leading this strike. So I don't have the words to describe the role of feminism during the strike. You can see the performance on all the pictures and images in our country. Also, we released a manifesto of the first National Feminist Convention, and I encourage you to read that. This was a month ago. And we created very recently a political movement called Estamos Listas, We're Ready, which calls for representation of feminism in politics. We achieved one of the seats in one of the most conservative districts of our country. And I think this is a great step forward to have a feminist state and to have feminism to place life in the forefront and not the profit rates as we are seeing today in Latin America. I think these are small achievements that are very important, but feminism is one of the few social movements that creates hope for the youth and that is still growing in this interaction between generations to inspire all of us and during these hard times. Thank you very much. Well, I think we closed a great panel with Alison, with Fernanda, Lena, and Natalia. Thank you very much to Carmen Diana, who organized this panel and this dialogue amongst ourselves. But there's something that I think it's very important. Definitely, we have seen what life economy is. And I think this is our way forward, because it's not only about public policies, it's also about sustainability, it's ecofeminism, is placing Prevish, one of the greatest thinkers. We should question that, we should question the colonial state, and to think of feminisms as something that is completely different of what we learned as we were children, European feminism. We need to build our own feminism. There are many ideas that are left here. Well, this is recorded, so I encourage all of you who are here to rewatch the video and that we can share this with other people outside of IAFFE. I think this has been excellent. And I would like to continue this conversation, but we need to conclude to go to the other panels. So thank you very much. It's been really my pleasure to be here on this roundtable of Latin American feminists of an unorthodox economy, an unorthodox feminist economy, and above all, seeing the threats behind this patriarchal state. And something that's very important is that if there are no women in parliament, this is not achieved, and we need to have the feminist agenda in place. I would say that the feminist agenda is one in the streets, and definitely the lesson given by Argentina is that for over 15 years, they struggled and they won this battle. And this is very important to take into account. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you also to Andrea Collins, who has been here, and our interpreters. So thank you very much. And to all of you, a great hug. See you soon.